Authoritarian dictators are obsessed with power. At the end of the day, that's all that really matters in the eyes of one. And it's not just being Grand Generalissimo or President for life or Emperor, it's everything else that comes with it. The reverence, the cult of personality, the fear you sense from everyone, even your supposed friends, the minute you walk into a room. Knowledge is power. Fear is power. Power is power. Some dictators manage to go their entire lives without any imminent threat to their regime. However, as many or more never get to enjoy being surrounded by family on their beds as they pass away peacefully after having made so many lives a living hell. So let me ask you all a question. What happens when you, the maniacal authoritarian leader who spent decades desperately clawing to the top and then holding on to the top of power, feels the walls begin closing in and everything you've worked for is crashing down around you? What happens when your reign is over and your empire falters? What do most of them do? They embarrass themselves, and when you peel back the scary persona and the massive ego, you find that every single one acts like the petulant children that exist deep within them. About to be ousted from power? Threaten and enact sabotage on a level unfathomable to rational people. Enemy at your gates and certain punishment coming for you and your inner circle? It's not your fault this happened. It's everyone else's fault. It's pathetic and fascinating to learn about the final spiraling moments of a dictator that can't or won't believe this is happening to them. And if they hadn't hurt other people in the process of burning out like a star, it almost would have been sad. Which is precisely why Operation Cinder was such an interesting event to learn about while reading up on Star Wars, because it gives us Star Wars' example of what happens when an authoritarian monster who centers everything around himself and his well-being loses it all.
Operation Cinder is to begin at once.
Operation Cinder is essentially the fictional answer to the hypothetical question, what would happen if Albert Speer actually obeyed the Nero Decree given by Adolf Hitler at the end of World War II? The Nero Decree was one of Adolf Hitler's final orders before the end of the Third Reich. Germany was suffering loss after loss. The desperate Ardennes offensive, known by its more famous name, the Battle of the Bulge, had failed to break the advance of Allied American, Canadian, Belgian, and British troops making their way into Europe. It was the final major German offensive of the war and was one of the major signals that Germany's defeat was indeed inevitable. With the Allied forces pushing through the Western Front and the formidable Soviet army powering through the East, with both heading straight for Berlin, Hitler decided that the failure of his regime should be placed squarely on the German people, and his orders to destroy the German infrastructure was both a vain attempt to prevent Allied forces from using it, but also a form of punishing Germany's people for, in his crazed mind, failing to be up to the challenge of the Thousand-Year Reich. Albert Speer, one of Hitler's most trusted subordinates and a member of his infamous inner circle, was tasked with seeing Hitler's decree carried out. According to Speer, he had serious reservations about destroying German infrastructure, objected to the decree, and, in a rare act of defiance, didn't carry out the order, though there's a lot about Speer's testimony regarding pretty much everything to do with his accounts of the Third Reich and his complicitness in it that is considered at best dubious by historians. But Speer as a subject is a story for another time and another video. This order stems from the mind of a man who has thrown his final capable armies at the enemy and been met with significant defeats in response. With no other option than the slow realization that his so-called glorious Thousand-Year Reich wouldn't last a tenth of that time, Hitler entered the year 1945 with no cards left, waiting for his inevitable defeat. History is littered with men of power like Hitler, refusing to see what's in front of them. Defeat is never their own fault, and victory is always thanks to them. Now let's look at a fictional character who is heavily inspired by some of the most infamous sore losers and power-hungry authoritarian rulers in human history. Palpatine, for all of his cackling and bragging, was always a fairly buttoned-up big villain. His plans were meticulous, well thought out, and even when something went wrong, he was able to shift it to his advantage and make the most of a situation that would have undone most less patient masterminds. The amount of patience it took is mind-boggling. His plot to destroy the Jedi, reshape the Republic into the Galactic Empire, will go down as the most impressive victory in fictional bad guy history. Even when his plans were threatened by unforeseen factors, it always felt like Palpatine was utterly in control, trying not to laugh as the Jedi Masters Yoda and Mace Windu, probably the only two Jedi alive that would present him with a serious challenge, would talk to him about finding the second Sith Lord. Imagine the satisfaction that must have been swirling around him as he oversaw the systematic elimination of not only his biggest political rival, but his biggest spiritual counterpart as well. He won about as completely as humanly possible, and he was ready to enjoy that victory for a very, very long time. Being the Emperor was just the beginning. As a Sith, perhaps the greatest and most ambitious in Star Wars history, it surely never would have been enough. What was to stop him from reaching beyond the galaxy? Fascists always need something to galvanize against. Who's to say the Chiss wouldn't be the next big enemy had the Empire eliminated the rebellion? Palpatine certainly planned on holding on indefinitely. He would have tried his best to ensure he'd see that happen. After years and years of winning, after decades of watching Palpatine gorge himself on power and influence, it's no surprise he was primed for the crash out of the century in Operation Cinder. At the climax of the Battle of Endor, Palpatine found himself in the process of killing Luke Skywalker, who had only moments ago refused Palpatine's offer to join the dark side and take the recently defeated Darth Vader's place. Fortunately for the galaxy, and unfortunately for Palpatine, watching his son die in front of him was the one line Vader wasn't willing to cross, and he sacrificed what was left of his body to send Palpatine screaming and falling into the pit of the second Death Star and his presumed death. We now know that the 2019 film Rise of Skywalker reveals that Palpatine had survived the events of Endor and secretly managed to send his conscience into deep space and begin plotting his revenge via the Eternal Empire and the First Order, and attempted to take over the galaxy again before being thwarted a final time, at least hopefully, by Rey Skywalker and her friends and allies. But let's talk mainly about that period of time after Endor that introduces Operation Cinder. Operation Cinder was the final posthumous decree of Emperor Palpatine where, in the event of his death, the surviving, specially chosen Imperial leaders were tasked with systematically destroying both rebellious worlds and the Empire's controlled worlds via orbital bombardment. Not even Palpatine's home planet of Naboo, or the famously loyal Vardos, Iden Versio's home planet, was safe from Operation Cinder. Palpatine explains his rationale to his protege and the eventual chief custodian of Operation Cinder, Fleet Admiral Gallius Rax. If an empire cannot protect its emperor, then the empire must be deemed a failure. It collapses not only because its central figure is gone, but because it must not be allowed to remain. Shortly after the Battle of Endor and Palpatine's death was confirmed, the emperor's final command was sent out to a select group of high-ranking and loyal imperial officers like Admiral Garrick Versio of the Imperial Security Bureau to begin this operation. Cinder may be referred to as a military operation, but there was nothing militarily strategic about it. Worlds were bombarded from orbit by Imperial Star Destroyers and giant satellites, loyal worlds or otherwise. Countless civilians, loyal or not, were killed and displaced as a result of the Empire's actions. The Empire began fighting itself just as much as it had been fighting the Rebellion and later the New Republic. Palpatine's goal was to constantly remind the galaxy that even in death, his shadow would always be over them. How dare the citizens fail to protect their dear leader? They're nothing without their leader, and their leader will ensure that they won't survive either. That was the philosophy of Palpatine, who, unbeknownst to virtually the entire galaxy, was a Sith Lord. And once you keep in mind that he is in fact a Sith Lord, everything else about him starts to make sense. The power-drunk Sith Lord, who had dominated the galaxy for decades, didn't want to give it up, even in death. It didn't deserve to exist beyond his life, or at the very least not without a constant reminder of pain and suffering. The sheer arrogance of the idea of punishing Imperial civilians for a death many had nothing to do with all leads back to his life and ideology as a Sith Lord. The Sith Code, which was written by David Gator, who has stated several times that it was inspired heavily by Mein Kampf, feels very present in the ideology behind and the planning and execution of Operation Cinder. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. Operation Cinder is a direct representation of the dark side, of Palpatine more specifically. It's a representation of a regime knowing it's on its last leg, and thus deciding that if they can't rule over others with an iron fist, they will hurt those who in their eyes caused their demise. It is a final, ungraceful, and selfish act of defiance equivalent to losing a game of chess and then immediately flipping the board over. In fact, during the final battle of the Galactic Civil War, the Battle of Jakku, it was revealed that the major engagement between the New Republic and Empire was orchestrated by Palpatine's protege, Fleet Admiral Gallius Rax, who carried Palpatine's posthumous authority to enforce Operation Cinder. Rax and Palpatine had planned for the engagement to be a final rebuke of the New Republic that would have resulted in the destruction of the planet, along with both Imperial and Republic armies and navies. Though that attempt was ultimately thwarted by Grand Admiral Ray Sloane and the war was effectively over shortly afterwards, the damage by the time the dust cleared was done. Worlds like Vardos remained devastated by the orbital bombardments, even suffering from raining atmospheric acid years and decades after the attacks. There isn't any number estimate of casualties, but given that the operation was a galaxy-wide effort, it's likely in the hundreds of thousands at minimum. This was a systematic terror campaign the Galactic Empire conducted largely on its own citizens, with the primary goal to reiterate Emperor Palpatine's philosophy to innocent people: if I can't have my toy, no one else can. Creating a battle station capable of destroying planets not once, but twice. Returning to the galaxy with an entire fleet of Star Destroyers, each capable of destroying a planet by itself, showcases Palpatine's obsession with absolute power and remaining in absolute power. Because in his soul, the very essence of Palpatine is that of a megalomaniac with an unmatched arrogance, delusions of grandeur, and a god complex in its worst possible form. Someone that utterly devoted to himself and so used to using people to further his own goals would obviously come up with some elaborate and callous plan to inflict as much damage as possible on his way out the door. He is a cold, evil man, and he was so sure of himself, so confident in having a natural-born right to the galaxy, that when the galaxy told him otherwise, when the Force told him otherwise, he flipped the table and attacked everyone, even his allies. He returned and attempted to rule by force decades later, holding on to life in the crudest way possible, because there's no Force Ghost shenanigans allowed for that black heart, just because he believed the Empire had no right to exist without him as the centerpiece. There is no successor to Palpatine. It's just Palpatine. It's eternally Palpatine. And like the first time, the galaxy decided, hopefully for the final time, that Palpatine's destiny was oblivion. Fitting end for a man who devastated a galaxy, endorsed and orchestrated countless atrocities over his tenure as a public figure and leader, and only ever saw himself in charge. And like we talked about at the beginning of the video, people who think like Palpatine, who laugh at the suffering of others and punish those who dare to speak out against their rule, are, unfortunately, not unique to Star Wars or fiction in general. These are uniquely power-hungry men that only care about their place in the world, their status and wealth, their influence. Not the people they govern, not the people they terrify. And if and when that status is threatened and brutality, blasting propaganda, or intimidation don't work anymore, you see these men for who they really are: pathetic, paranoid, sore losers that would rather burn it all down than see that power ever leave their hands. Thank you guys for watching. If you did enjoy, please hit the like button and subscribe, as well as hit the bell icon if you want to see more deep dives into a galaxy far, far away like this one. As always, thanks for watching. Continue to keep safe in this crazy world we live in. Love each other, and remember, the Force will be with you always.